Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Stir Shaken After June 30th, 2021, sponsored by NetNumber. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. The Q&A is located under the slide view. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit them to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green Resource List widget. Towards the end of today's presentation, we'll ask you for your feedback. A survey is already open on your screen and will only take 1 minute to complete. Your feedback is extremely helpful. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available about 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I would now like to turn the event over to Heavy Readings Research Director, Cloud and Security, Jim Hodges. Jim?
Thanks, operator, and welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is entitled Stir Shaken After June 30th, 2021. My name is Jim Hodges, and I am Research Director at Cloud and Security Heavy Reading. And today we'll be talking about Stir Shaken and really the role that Stir Shaken plays in user validation for call termination. So we have with us today from our sponsor NetNumber, Michael Campbell. Michael is the Senior Product Manager at NetNumber. Welcome, Michael. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Jim. Looking forward to presenting it.
Great. So today's session is really three key parts. At first, we're going to talk a little bit about Stir Shaken from a technology overview, take a look at how Stir Shaken technology works, kind of a reference architecture, and then we'll talk about all the Stir Shaken implementation timelines, which are obviously critical to meeting regulatory compliance, and then we'll have a section that'll talk about Stir Shaken in the context of preparation steps, so things that service providers are going to need to do to make sure that they're compliant, and really some strategies for helping them kind of plan their support of Stir Shaken. So really interesting webinar, really timely as well, because as the title indicates, we're getting very close to the June 30th implementation date for the United States. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Michael. I'll push out your first slide, Michael. Please go ahead.
All right. Excuse me. Thanks, Jim. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. As Jim indicated, today is June 23rd. It's exactly a week away from June 30th, the implementation deadline for Stir Shaken here in the United States. So we as an industry have, of course, been building to this date, and an awful lot of time, attention, and effort has been focused on it. But we're only a week away from that date at this moment, so we thought it would be timely to look beyond that date at this point and see what happens after June 30th and what things must carriers be aware of and what do they need to take account of as we go by that date and it gets into the rearview mirror instead of in front of us. So as Jim mentioned, we're going to do a quick overview just of Stir Shaken technology as it exists today. And quickly review what is going to happen on June 30th. It's a little more than you may think, actually. And then dive into the next big date, which is September 28th. We'll look at what happens on that date and what the implications are for carriers, particularly international carriers. Beyond these hard date issues, then we'll look into two other regulatory developments that are really going to impact the environment after those dates. The first is a relaxation of the requirements to participate in Stir Shaken that have some impacts that you may not be aware of. And also the FCC's recent effort to bring up the regulatory date for smaller carriers who did have an exemption until June of 2023 back to June of 2022. I find that this has been somewhat misunderstood, and so we're just going to run through that and make sure that everybody's aware of what that means to smaller carriers. However, carriers with extensions are going to have to decide what they want to do with that. We'll look at what it means to have an extension and why perhaps you really don't want to use that to its full extent. And then we'll really sort of put the binoculars on and start looking a little farther forward. What happens to Stir Shaken or in the Stir Shaken world after those things have come and gone? And we'll look at TDM support. We'll look at enterprise support, international Stir Shaken. How do international carriers get calls into the United States with an A attestation? And look at some other basic call types that have not yet been covered and how that will happen. We'll wrap that up with some conclusions and go into Q&A. So very aggressive and action-packed agenda here, so let's get going. First of all, what is stir shaken? I know this is probably going to be second nature to most people at this point if you're on this, but stir shaken simply is the FCC's answer to putting an end to fraudulent robocalls. The essence of stir shaken really is that originating carriers attest to their degree of faith in the presented calling line ID, and then attach that attestation to the signaling for the call and pass that across to the terminating network, who extracts that and uses that attestation to drive the end user's display with typically some sort of a verification mark. A green check mark is very commonly used. The attestations that an originating provider can make are listed as A, B, and C, very inventively listed as A, B, and C. A essentially says they completely trust the caller ID. They know the customer. They know the number. Usually they've provided the number to them themselves, and they have full faith in the presented caller ID. That is the attestation that the terminating provider will use to drive a green check mark on a display. Partial attestation indicates that they know the customer, but they're not sure about the right of that customer to use the number. And a gateway or a C attestation is really all bets are off. We don't know the customer. We don't know the number. Approach this call at your own caution. So that's the essence of how this works. Now, the actual mechanism for making that happen is a little more complicated. What I'm presenting here on this chart is two sets of reference architecture ideas from ATIS, the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions, who together with IETF have really brought us stir shaken. If I was to try and walk through this picture just quickly from the top to the bottom, and I'm going to focus on the smaller picture on the left-hand side. The business of signing calls and verifying those signatures are the two boxes in color at the bottom. STIAS, the authentication service, is the thing that asserts the attestation and signs that off. And the STIVS, the verification service, is the terminating network's function, if you will. It decodes the attestation, pulls it out, and does what's necessary. Now, it's a lot more controlled than what I've just described. The originating network attests to what it knows about the caller ID, and then it signs that with a cryptographic signature, which is itself secured by a certificate that has been generated at the national level at the top of this chart. We'll get back to that in a minute. The terminating network, when it receives a signature on a call, first of all checks that the originating carrier had a valid certificate. If that's the case, then it decodes the signature for the call, and if the originating carrier had a valid certificate and the signature decodes all right, then it will withdraw the attestation from that signature and use it to drive the display. So the really important thing there, I think, perhaps, is that the right to play this game is controlled by certificates that are delivered by the national level. So if we cast our eyes up to the top of this chart, the national level really consists of two things. The STIPA, the policy administrator, and the STICA, the certification authority. The PA's major function really is to allow or disallow any carrier from participating in stir shaken. So anybody that wants to participate in stir shaken has to get registered with and authorized by the STIPA as a first step. And that all by itself excludes a number of the bad guys because they're just not going to get that kind of authorization from the PA. If once a carrier has been registered with the PA, they can ask the CA, the certification authority, for a certificate. These certificates are, speaking a little loosely, these certificates are used to sign calls and validate the signatures. So the only way you can sign calls is if you've gotten a certificate from the certification authority, and you can only do that if you've been registered by the PA. Now, the whole business of generating these certificates and making them available is what's handled in the middle layer here, the key management layer. And there's three elements there, SKS, KMS, and CR, which are responsible for generating the keys, making them available for signing, and making them available for verification, respectively. So that's a quick walkthrough of how stir shaken works at an architecture level. And if I summarize that, a carrier gets registered with the STI-PA. They generate keys at their SPKMS, generate certificates through the STI-CA, and then use those certificates to sign calls via the authentication service. And if they're receiving calls, they can verify the signatures that they've received using the STI-VS, which will then go back and check the certificates that have been made available by the originating carrier. So that's a whirlwind tour of how stir shaken works at an architecture level. Now, this is all in the context of IP, typically SIP and VoIP. And so it covers those kind of calls, but it doesn't, as we see it here, cover TDM. Now, ADIS is busy working on that, and they have proposed a reference architecture for TDM that frankly, on the face of this, it looks a little more complicated because it's not actually a mirror image of the previous picture with some new pieces added. But if you were to go compare these two back and forth, you'd find that the new pieces that have been added for TDM are the pieces that are in dark gray. And you'll see 3 of them on each side of this picture. The left side is the originating and the right side is the terminating. Of that bunch, the 2 that are really critical are the piece you see called STI-CPS. And STI-CPS stands for Call Placement Service. The idea of TDM shaken or extending stir shaken into the TDM domain is brilliantly simple. Normally with stir shaken, the signature for the call embedded in a new header called an identity header is attached to the SIP signaling and sent through the signaling network to the other side. TDM SS7, of course, can't do that. It was never designed for that. So if you can't transport the signed identity header via signaling, why not pass it through an out-of-band cloud repository? And that's, at its essence, what STI-CPS is. It is just a cloud-based database into which an originating network can place a signature for a call and to which a terminating network can go to get the signature for the call. All the rest of stir shaken stays exactly the same. All that really changes is how you transport the identity header from the originator to the terminator. That's I mean, brilliantly simple, I think, is how I like to say this. Worth noting that you can do this for SIP as well, and you might want to do this for SIP, essentially pass the identity header in a redundant way, both through the signaling and through a CPS, to provide yourself with some assurance that that SIP call that you've just signed might hit some SS7 transport along the way between the originator and the terminator. If it does that, any signed identity header gets stripped off because SS7 doesn't know how to deal with that. And the call, even though it's been properly signed and taken care of, may arrive at termination without that signature. So the TDM shaken architecture can really be used not just for TDM, but also as an insurance policy against TDM transport in the middle of two SIP communicating entities. So that's the general look at the architecture for IP and TDM stir shaken. Now, there's a lot of boxes here, and what this probably means to you as a carrier, if you just look at this and start counting up all the boxes and all the functions you have to put into your network, this looks like a devil of a network impact and a real serious job for you to even think about. Now, happily, what a great number of vendors have done, stir shaken solution vendors, including my own company, NetNumber, what they've done is implement stir shaken in the cloud. So all of the boxes that you saw on those reference architecture diagrams have been implemented. Maybe this is an exercise for the student. Go back and check the boxes on the previous diagrams and see that they're all here in this one. They are. All implemented in the cloud so that instead of having to impact your network, all you really have to do is access a cloud service. And in the very simplified diagram that I'm showing here, I list this as almost no network impact to you to implement this. All you really have to do is get the session control elements in your network, switches, SPCs, border gateways, wherever you can see the traffic in a reasonable manner. All you need to do is get those to access the cloud service, to sign calls, and to verify those signatures respectively. ADIS has kindly given us a standardized interface for this, ADIS 10082. I suppose I should probably call that 1,000,082, but most people seem to say it as 10,082. They've given us the ATIS 10,082 interface that allows the session control elements in your network to just access the cloud directly and essentially have all of this stir, shake, and processing, all of that complexity taken care of by the cloud. This is, as I say, an almost no network impact. The only fly in this ointment is that an awful lot of older network session control elements simply don't know how to speak this ATIS 10,082 interface. Or in some cases, vendors will make it very expensive for you or very problematic to upgrade existing elements to do this. So the solution to that has been, for almost every stir-shaken implementation vendor, to provide what amounts to a network assist element to offload that kind of function if you can't teach the existing session control elements to do that. My particular company has created an element called Cloud Connect, and it's just an element that watches the signaling in the network and drives that ATIS 10,082 interface for you. The way I've shown this picture, it's sitting directly astride of the signaling, but there are lots of different ways to do this so that that is not the case, so that it sees the signaling but doesn't have to be in the middle of it. And that number is not unique in this regard. I think many solution vendors for stir-shaken solutions have some form of in-network assist element, whether it be added software on an existing session control or some other specific element that perhaps you need to add to the network. But in some way, there is the ability to put something in your network to ring fence or minimize the impact on your existing network elements. So this is an almost no network impact with an in-network assist. And so what this really means to you in the end is you do have the choice, as you look at implementing stir-shaken, to build all those boxes yourself. And some people are doing that. You also have the choice, however, simply to fundamentally use stir-shaken as a service in the cloud and access it via this standardized interface, either directly from your network or indirectly through some kind of an in-network assist product that you can get from most solution vendors. So that's the sort of the general operation of stir-shaken and how it impacts your network. Hopefully not a whole lot. What do you get for all of this? All of this clever technology really comes down to very, very simple operation from the end user perspective. What I've shown here is a screenshot that I actually took off my own phone. So this is a real stir-shaken processed call, and all you really get for all this technology is the words number verified or words like that, and some form of a verification mark, a green check mark. Now the presentation is up to the individual operators. But what you end up with is this deceptively simple but incredibly powerful little bit of additional information. This information lets you know whether or not this is potentially a fraudulent call or whether you can trust that the caller ID is being represented properly and the caller is who they say they are. You then are armed with the additional information it takes to decide, am I going to answer this call or am I not going to answer this call? And that simple thing is enormously powerful. So this is what you end up with when you've implemented all of this this great stir-shaken technology. Calls that you receive are either validated as being correct or not. Jim, you have a question?
So Michael, yeah, just really interesting. It's nice to see the actual screenshot here. So you said obviously the presentation format will vary by provider. Just a question: does this green check mark is it basically an A attestation, or is it B, or what is this check mark? Is it kind of fully validated from an identity perspective? What is it? What would it mean?
That's a great question, Jim. I should have covered that. Yeah. The only thing in general that will drive a green check mark on a display is an A attestation. In general, what everybody is aiming for is to get an A attestation, because most device manufacturers, that is the only thing that will actually drive that green check mark. So really, this represents A. That's what it's all about.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, super. Okay, so Let's have a quick look at some of the regulatory headlines that are driving this environment. We'll go through this pretty quickly, but we're going to keep coming back to these things one after another as we go. So you're all probably aware that in December of 2019, the USA Trace Act was passed that established this June 30th deadline that we're all working to, and we're here talking about what happens afterwards today. And essentially said by that date you have to have all IP portions of your network covered by STIR/SHAKEN. On October of 2020, almost a year later, the FCC issued its second report. There's a typo here, not regulation. Second report and order that established a whole lot of criteria around this. Some really, really important ones was the requirement to file certifications with the FCC indicating how you had met the requirements of the Trace Act, and also a requirement to reject traffic from carriers who had not done that. Now, there were no dates established at that point. It just said, we're going to do this. We're going to require you to certify with the FCC that you are STIR/SHAKEN compliant, and we're going to require you to reject traffic from carriers who are not. And that includes foreign carriers, by the way. And we'll come back to you with dates is fundamentally what that was all about. A little bit later, April 2021 this year, the FCC announced those dates, and the date to file with them is June 30th of this year. That date sounds pretty familiar, right? That is the STIR/SHAKEN implementation date as well. They announced that date as the date to have filings into their new robocall mitigation database, the RMD, and the deadline for rejecting calls from carriers who are not in that database was set as September 28th of 2021. So we've added a little bit extra here to the June 30th date and established a new really important date, September 28th. And then recently the FCC had made a lot of noise about advancing the deadline for small carriers who did have an exemption until 2023 back to 2022. Or they made some noise about it. They didn't necessarily make it a thing yet, and we'll go into that in a lot more detail. So those are the major regulatory developments that are kind of impacting or shaping the landscape that we're on. The last one I want to mention is the STIGA, the governance authority in the United States for STIR/SHAKEN, also relaxed the requirement for participating in STIR/SHAKEN. Previously, you had to be a TNSP or a numbering authority, registered with the FCC as a number authority in order to be able to participate in STIR/SHAKEN. And that meant that some intermediate carriers and a lot of over-the-top VoIP carriers, and anybody who was not directly owning their own TN resources but getting them from someone else, really didn't have to play this game if they didn't want to. Well, they've relaxed that requirement now, and so that has some implications for these carriers that we'll look into as well. So that's the regulatory environment that's shaping what we're doing right now. So let's look at June 30th. 7 days from now, what happens on that date? And I have listed this as a seismic change in the telecom landscape because we're suddenly bringing the security of our telephone network back into the modern age, where previously we had been depending on the reasonably closed and highly secure nature of the older TDM networks. Of course, as the deluge of robocalls has shown, that hasn't been too effective. So on this date, June 30th, all the IP portions of the network must be covered with STIR/SHAKEN, and the FCC has further said that all the non-IP portions, or fundamentally the TDM portions of the network that are not covered by STIR/SHAKEN, must be covered by some form of robocall, another typo, some form of robocall mitigation program that takes reasonable steps. I love the term reasonable steps. Takes reasonable steps to ensure that fraudulent robocalls aren't being generated on the non-IP portion of the network. So really, they've said you must protect IP with STIR/SHAKEN, you must protect non-IP with reasonable measures to ensure that you are not generating fraudulent robocalls in your network. Of course, as we've seen, also, they've required you to certify with this new robocall mitigation database what steps you have taken, and we'll see coming up, they've required you to take some extra steps when that's not the case. Now, what's really important here is that if I add just a little bit of color to this, what they've said is that any incoming call to your network that is using North American Number Plan resources or a North American Number Plan CLI will only be accepted if the carrier presenting that call is in the robocall mitigation database. Now, if you are a foreign carrier, a Vodafone, a DTAG, pick a carrier that is terminating traffic to the United States, and you are providing traffic, for example, from U.S. roamers, you're presenting calls to the United States using North American number plan resources. And those calls may be rejected if you, a foreign carrier, have not registered in the FCC's robocall mitigation database. This is a widely misunderstood ruling, and we're going to dig into this just a little bit more in a minute. But this has certainly sparked a flurry of activity to make sure that most major international carriers are actually fundamentally complying to a regulatory authority that is not from their own country. It's sort of an interesting thing going on there. All right, let's move to our first poll question, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So interesting. So the logical poll question here is, where are we? As you said, we're 7 days away from June 30th and the stir, shake, and timeline in the United States. So the question for the audience is, what is the likelihood that U.S.-based communication service providers, or CSP, will meet the June 30th stir, shake, and timeline? Extremely likely, likely, somewhat likely, or not likely at all. So if you can now provide us your input, that'll be helpful. And I guess, Michael, while we're waiting, it's interesting you were talking about the architecture, about running a lot of these functions in the cloud today, whether it's public cloud or telco cloud. And I mean, I've been covering session border control as part of my area of coverage for the last 10 years. And I started seeing about 6 years ago, there was kind of a move to take session border control and kind of run it in the cloud because of scale and for enterprise services. So it's an interesting thing that in many respects, the architecture is straightforward, but it also is something that some service providers, as they've gone through NFV, are probably familiar with as well in terms of running workloads in the cloud. And just in general, the trend that I'm seeing, a lot of more telco workloads will start running in the public cloud as we move to 5G and services like that. So it's an interesting architecture. It's just kind of straightforward and kind of aligned with everything else we've seen as well. So,
yeah,
would you agree with that?
Trend. Yeah, absolutely. I think more, as you said, more and more telecom workload in general is moving to the cloud, which presents some interesting security issues of its own, but it's definitely where things are going.
Right. Okay, so let's see what the audience said. So 32%, kind of a tie, somewhat likely, wow. And somewhat likely and likely are 33%, and then extremely likely, so the more bullish CSPs, 22%, and then only 14% not likely at all. So overall, I think it shows that pretty solid numbers. I think probably a little higher in the likely than I thought, or this extremely likely. So I think it's a positive thing. It kind of shows that all these timelines and getting ready for attestation, I guess timelines has really paid off. So any surprises here from your perspective?
No, actually, this is rather what I expected. I like to characterize the business case for stir shaken as do this or the FCC will hurt you, and I guess people are paying attention.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So let's move on now. Now we're going to talk a little bit about. So now we've kind of addressed sort of the requirements up to June 30th, and in the second half, Mike, you want to talk a little more about what happens kind of after June 30th. You've got June 30th. You've got some September 28th dates. There's some dates in there you want to talk about. So I'll push your first slide out. I'll turn the presentation back over to you, and you can continue with your presentation.
All right, super, Jim. Thanks. All right, what happens next? What's the next big date? I mentioned that September 28th was that next big date. Is June 30th the end, or is it just the beginning? It's very clearly not the end. However, once June 30th has come and gone, the IP portions of your network will be covered by stir shaken, non-IP by some form of robocall mitigation. And some people might think that that's enough, but not by a long shot. It really isn't. And the FCC, of course, has said September 28th, you have to do something pretty significant. On that date, you have to start rejecting traffic from any carrier who is not registered with the robocall mitigation database. And that, as I said, includes foreign carriers. Now, of course, United States roamers around the world are the legitimate major use case for that, but the real target for this requirement ends up being fraudulent offshore robocallers who are pumping fraudulent calls into the United States using spoofed CLI resources from the North American number plan. That's why this is happening. That's the real target for doing this. Now, this has caused a lot of confusion. I think I've talked personally to a number of carriers overseas who are under the erroneous impression that unless they have registered with the robocall mitigation database, all of their calls are going to be rejected starting September 28th. And that's just not the case. So what I've done here is drawn a little picture. On the left-hand side, I just called it non-USA call sources. This is every country in the world that might want to be presenting calls to the United States and having those calls processed through and delivered to a terminating party in the United States. And I broke this up into three sort of classes of callers: U.S. roamers, local landline callers, and local mobile callers. All of these, of course, might be generated by their host opco and go directly to the United States, or they might go through an IPX along the way. But either way, these calls will arrive into the United States. And as we look at each one of these three, we'll see there may be slightly different treatment with them. Remember that the requirement in the second report and order is that if it uses North American number plan resources, it must be checked in the robocall mitigation database, and it must not be accepted if the presenting carrier is not in that database. So if I look at the first class of calls, this is U.S. roamers that are overseas calling home. What you'll see there is they meet the criteria of the second report in order. This is a North American number plan CLI, and that carrier will be checked against the robocall mitigation database. Now, if the carrier is registered there, then the call can proceed. If the carrier is not registered there, the call will be rejected. Being registered there, however, doesn't mean you get an A attestation. That just means the call can carry on. It will not be rejected. The call will still likely get a C attestation at this point, and it will in all likelihood, as we discussed, not drive any kind of verification mark on the end user's device. So the net there is that if the foreign carrier is registered in the robocall mitigation database, their call will be accepted into the United States and delivered to its termination, but it will not be presented with an A attestation without some other form of work happening. And we will talk about that in a little bit later, what would happen there.
Michael, just very quickly,
Jim?
in this scenario, though, so the call terminates, the user doesn't get necessarily a attestation, but they could potentially see the calling line ID, though, so they could still know that that's something they want to answer, correct?
That is possible, yeah. And then this may be a function both of how calling line ID is delivered across the global telecom network and what you have in your local telephone book as well.
Your contacts, yeah. Okay,
your
got it.
contacts,
Okay, thank you.
So there are mitigations for that, to overuse the word mitigation. If I look at the second type of call, this is a local landline call coming from a foreign country. Perhaps this is mom and dad in Germany calling their siblings, their siblings who have immigrated to the United States. This is a local call. It's not using North American number plan resources. So when that call arrives, there's no requirement for the initial service provider in the United States to check the robocall mitigation database. And that call will be allowed to proceed as is. It will not be rejected even if that carrier is not registered. Call will, of course, get a C attestation, and it will be delivered probably without any kind of a verification mark. Again, as Jim just mentioned, of course, if mom and dad are in my contacts list on my phone, I'll get their caller ID and I'll know I should answer that call. But in the absence of that sort of stuff, there'll be nothing there really that visually separates that call from my mom and dad in Germany from a fraudulent robocall that's come in from overseas. So you're 6 of one, half a dozen of the other there. And the same thing happens, of course, with a local mobile call. And I separated these out simply because probably the best secured telecom networks in the world are mobile networks. But still, in the end, the stir-shaken infrastructure requires that if I'm going to give an A attestation to something, I must have definitive knowledge that the presented caller ID is right. And even though a mobile call is highly secured in the country that it's in, I don't know anything about that when it arrives into the United States. So again, that call using local resources from, in this case, I think I showed a European country, will be allowed to proceed, but will still get a C attestation because the service provider that's terminating this call to the United States doesn't really know anything about it.
So, Michael, just really quickly, is there any sort of
question? Yeah.
Yeah, put my hand up. Is there any sort of granularity in terms of this for this third example for the local mobile in terms of prepaid, postpaid, or MVNO versus, say, traditional mobile postpaid number? So, if you're calling either from an MVNO based in Germany or you're calling from Deutsche Telekom, or is there any sort of granularity difference, or would the architecture basically the same?
The architecture is really basically the same. The legal requirement on the U.S. carrier is the same, irrespective of the mechanism of access from the foreign country. So in the end, they are required to be able to assert to the FCC, if the FCC should come calling, that they only gave an A attestation to numbers that met the criteria we talked about early on. Namely that I know the customer and I know definitively that they have a right to use that number. And really, no matter what the access mechanism in the foreign country, they simply won't be able to do that without some additional infrastructure in place.
Okay, and that makes sense to me now why you have this A attestation that's so rigid, not rigid, but there's so many different checks, because really what you want to be able to do is kind of have one level of support, and then the others you can manage in terms of how you route them based on B or C. But at the end of the day, it's really A attestation that gets you kind of the full power, if you will, of STIR/SHAKEN, correct?
Yeah, well, there's one other piece that really we haven't addressed here in this webinar at all, and that's what do you do when something goes wrong? Part of this, the mitigation of errors in the system. There is an industry traceback group here in the United States that is charged with or implements. I will call it backing up bad calls. So if I get a call delivered with a green check mark, and it turns out to be one of those people trying to sell me fraudulent insurance or telling me they're from the IRS and need my credit card right now, I can use information in that signature to trace the call backwards to its source. And eventually the source in this case would be the U.S. service provider block on this picture. And the FCC, or the industry traceback group, will quite rightly say, why did you give that an A attestation? What was the criteria for that? And so the enforcement ability that provides is, I think, the other secret superpower of STIR/SHAKEN that I think is probably gets far too little attention. And we're not giving it enough attention in this webinar either.
Yeah.
But,
great point. Okay, I'll let you get back. I'll let you get back to your presentation. Yeah, great, thanks.
All right. So now we've got those hard date issues out of the way. What about, I mentioned earlier, this relaxation of the requirement to participate in STIR/SHAKEN. One of the requirements had always been that you were a TNSP, or a number authority, a registered number authority with the FCC here in the United States. And this just means you control your own TNs and are able to allocate those to your customers. The STIGA, the Governance Authority for STIR/SHAKEN, relaxed that requirement effective March 1st of this year. And that allows a lot more people to participate in STIR/SHAKEN who couldn't previously do so. So this looks like a good thing. On the face of it, it means that it makes it possible, for example, for smaller OTT VoIP providers or intermediary providers, any small service provider who doesn't control their own TN resources, it makes it possible for them to participate in STIR/SHAKEN too, which is a good thing, right? Because that means their calls can be presented with an A attestation. If I flip that coin over, or I sort of cut with the other side of the sword, however, it may be a bad thing, because it not only makes it possible for them to do this, it makes it mandatory for them to do this. It requires those providers to participate in STIR/SHAKEN. Now, up until this point, they had a permanent exemption. The way the whole STIR/SHAKEN infrastructure has been set up and the FCC's guidelines on this, if you could not participate, you had an indefinite extension. All of a sudden, that indefinite extension has been taken away from this class of exemptions, and you're suddenly liable to the June 30th date. Or are you? Well, the FCC has recognized that you've just been obligated to do this now, and can't really hold you accountable to the same date that they're holding everyone else accountable to. So I put a little quote here from the second report in order that should give you some comfort. They say they will not consider a voice service provider that diligently pursues a certificate once it's available to be in violation of the rules. Really, they've said, however, when you unpack that, you better be diligently working towards STIR/SHAKEN compliance and getting to that point as quickly as you can. So what does this mean to you? If you are not a number authority in the United States and you're operating an IP voice service, you are now obligated to participate in STIR/SHAKEN, and you will need to do that as quickly as you can. So this is a thing that I think some people have not completely understood, and wanted to just draw some focus onto that. So that's the TNSP. What about the noise the FCC is making about moving the small carrier exemption from June 2023 to June of 2022? Now previously, carriers who had less than 100,000 subscribers were given an extension on STIR/SHAKEN compliance until June of 2023, based on the observation that they're smaller, their revenue is lower, and the cost of implementation was perhaps an unwarranted burden on them relative to the big guys. And that was a very reasonable thing to do, give them more time to get ready. So why did the FCC suddenly put out a notice of proposed rulemaking and to talk about, gee, maybe that date is too generous? Well, what they've observed is fundamentally STIR/SHAKEN is working, and the bad guys are getting squeezed out of the big networks and are quickly migrating to the smaller networks where STIR/SHAKEN isn't required, and they're using those as a platform to pump their trash into the telecom network. The FCC noted this and said that there's a small percentage of small carriers who are originating a disproportionate amount of fraudulent traffic at this point. And for STIR/SHAKEN to work effectively, quickly, we're going to have to shut those down. So the whole notice of proposed rulemaking doesn't say, I'm going to do this at this point. It says, I'm thinking carefully about this, and I need to understand how to identify that subset of small carriers who are generating that disproportionate amount of stuff into the telecom network. So this is now out for comment. And for those of you who are not familiar with how rulemaking works at the FCC, this pretty much indicates that the FCC is going to do something about this. They're going to absorb the comments that come back. They're going to make some decisions, and there'll be some new rulemaking that goes with this. So what does this mean for you? This means that the ship is sailing, the clock is ticking. No matter how the final ruling is worded, some small carriers, it could be you, some small carriers are going to be erroneously swept up into the net that is established by the criteria. And even though you may not be generating the fraudulent traffic that is being protected against, you may be required to comply. If you're a small carrier, fundamentally what this says is you really should effectively treat your deadline date as June of 2022 from now on, not June of 2023, because until the ruling comes out, you have no idea whether you're really going to have that extra year or not, and it's probably more prudent to be getting ready faster than less quickly. So that's really the long and the short of that. Now I'm going to assert, however, that this is not a bad thing. You probably don't want to be using up your exemption anyway. If you have an extension, do you want to use it? It looks like it's a real bonus. The FCC has let you metaphorically push the snooze button on the STIR/SHAKEN alarm clock, and you get to defer this terrible expense. Good idea? No, it's really not. I'm going to assert you shouldn't use that at all, or you should only use it for as short a period of time as you can. And the reason for this is really simple. Your calls will not be delivered with an A attestation. Your competitors will. And your customers aren't going to miss that fact. And what happens when customers are unhappy with your service? They go somewhere else. The word is churn, and I haven't seen in my life anything that'll make a carrier business operations team run around with their hair on fire more quickly than churn will. And churn, of course, means you've got to replace those customers. So you've got higher acquisition costs. You've got lost revenue in the gap between them leaving and them being replaced. This is the net result of an extension. Yes, you can take it. Yes, you can defer the expense of becoming STIR/SHAKEN compliant. You really don't want to, because you're probably going to churn your customer base, lose revenue, and increase cost. This is really not a good deal. Without going into all the details, of course, there's one other thing here that just relates to where you are in the network topology and how you bill. Calls delivered without an A attestation are going to be completed on a less frequent basis than calls that are, and so you may end up with fewer billable minutes as well, and that's lower revenue, another source of lower revenue. But as we've just seen in the last chart, perhaps the worst thing of all here is the bad guys are going to take notice of the fact that you have an exemption and you're not STIR/SHAKEN compliant, and they're going to camp out on your network and start using you as their platform to pump trash into the telecom network. Excuse me. And as we've seen, that's happening already, and the FCC is already acting on that outcome. So frankly, I would recommend, if you have an extension, use as little of it as you can, become compliant as quickly as you can. All right, what's next? After all of that is done, what's next for STIR/SHAKEN? Well, I think the next largest development is TDM/SHAKEN. This is the idea, we looked at it earlier, of using an out-of-band repository, the call placement service, to transport signed identity headers for calls from the originator to the terminator, so that even SS7 transport can support the idea of STIR/SHAKEN. Brilliantly simple idea. I think the only thing that we really want to focus on here is that this is not something that might happen tomorrow or the day after. I should say perhaps will be happening tomorrow or the day after, because standardization work for this has completed in ATIS, and the draft standard is out to the membership for letter ballot right now. So my guess is we can expect that to be completed somewhere around the end of this month, again, about a week from now. And maybe this is one more thing that happens on June 30th. The TDM/SHAKEN solution becomes a standardized item with ATIS. Now, standardized doesn't mean it's been mandated by the FCC, but the FCC, in its second report in order, expressed what I would call backhanded support for this idea, noting somewhat caustically that the service providers who were opposed to the idea of TDM/SHAKEN certainly hadn't come up with any credible or better alternatives. Now, that strikes me as FCC speak for, we like this and we're going to mandate it once it's standardized. So what I would say as an observation to carriers who are not compliant yet is that it's a really good idea if you, when you're searching out a solution for STIR/SHAKEN, get one that supports both TDM/SHAKEN and IP STIR/SHAKEN. There are a few of those out there. My company, NetNumber, is one of those that offers a solution that supports both IP STIR/SHAKEN and TDM/SHAKEN. There are a small number of other vendors out there who do this as well. But no matter who you pick for your solution, you will save yourself a great deal of time and effort if you deploy a solution that supports both IP and TDM/SHAKEN right from day one. So I think that would be a recommendation coming out of that. Now, I think this is last but not least for us on this. What's right after that? Enterprise STIR/SHAKEN is right after that. In fact, enterprise STIR/SHAKEN is happening right now, and it may actually occur en masse ahead of TDM/SHAKEN. As a STIR/SHAKEN solution vendor, I find that we are seeing more attention, more customer interest to the enterprise scenario than we're seeing to almost anything else at this point. June 30th is almost here, and carriers are looking beyond that now and saying, what's next? Enterprise STIR/SHAKEN is what's next. And this is based on the observation, of course, that consumer calls are the type of calls that are largely mentioned by the FCC. They talk about consumer and small business. And those are the calls that will be protected by STIR/SHAKEN and will be delivered with a green check mark. What this means, however, is that enterprise calls will not be presented with a green check mark, and so their call answer rates are going to go down. it's not a level playing field anymore. If I'm an enterprise trying to reach my customers, I'm not going to be nearly as successful after June 30th. Now, Enterprise Stir Shaken tries to close that gap. And just to give you an example of how this works, I've used the classic Home Depot example that seems to show up in so many of the standards papers that we read. If Home Depot was to call you right now, goodness gracious, this is auto advancing. What's going on? If Home Depot was to call you right now and say that they were delivering something on Saturday, a call would look like this, and you probably wouldn't answer it. It's just an unknown caller ID, and that's that. So Enterprise Stir Shaken would like to level that playing field and at least make the call look like this. So it has a green check mark. Now, what it would really like to do, and what we're working on, is going farther than that and actually enriching that with the enterprise's logo, their name, and perhaps even a real-time reason for the call if that's available. What this does is move you from the call scenario on the left to the call scenario on the right. You go from, I'm not going to answer this call, to I'm absolutely going to answer this call. And this is the objective of Enterprise Stir Shaken. Now, the standards that lie behind this actually have reached critical mass at this point. The underlying certificate technology, delegate certificates, which we haven't really talked about here in this webinar at all, have been standardized as ATIS 10092. The rich call data, which carries the logo and the reason for the call and the calling name presentation, that has been standardized as ATIS 10094. So we have all the technology underpinnings in place to make this work. And as I said, my company and several others are actually, support this technology already and are doing, demos and POCs. And, actually we're working to put some customers in service with this right now. So this is the next wave. And for you as a carrier, just remember that there's arguably 30 million enterprises in the United States alone, all of whom are going to want to buy this service from you. So this is an enormous revenue opportunity for you. Stir Shaken has been quite a cost to this point. Leveling the playing field for enterprises so that they get A attestation as well presents to you a real revenue opportunity. So at last, some good news in the Stir Shaken landscape. Other than, the good news is we're going to drive the bad guys off the telecom network. That's good news. But even better news is you can make some money doing it. All right, and there's much, much more, of course. We've now talked about TDM and enterprise. We've mentioned briefly the business of international Stir Shaken, and really we saw in one of the earlier charts that the best you can really do right now is get a call into the United States with a C attestation. Well, how do you elevate that to an A? There is, I guess, this general notion of international or global Stir Shaken, which can do this for you. Again, my company, NetNumber, has a solution in this space. I think one or two other companies are postulating a solution in this space. But there is a way to do this. It's some additional infrastructure that takes advantage of a variety of other constructs to get you into a position where those calls can be delivered with an A attestation. So that's going to be a big and evolving area. But there's some basic things like multi-leg or diverted calls that are not yet covered. Some standards have been put in place, but not mandated by the FCC yet. Ditto for emergency calls. And hey, am I the only one who is seeing an increasing flood of spam text messages? You start pushing the bad guys off the telecom network, well, they're finding other places to go. Spam messages are one of them. And we're going to see some treatment of that, I think, with Stir Shaken technology in a year or two to come. And last but not least, I'll talk about what I just call gap closure. The bad guys are bad, but they're smart, they're well funded, and they're really motivated. They like making money. They're going to keep finding gaps in the armor that we're putting up with Stir Shaken, and they're going to try to exploit them, just like they've done moving to small networks, moving to text messaging, and so on. We as an industry are going to have to keep reacting to that. We're going to have to keep innovating, and we're going to have to keep pushing them out. Maybe it's a game of whack-a-mole, but eventually I think we can knock them entirely off the telecom network. So this brings us to a conclusion then, I think. And as regards going back to, this is titled Life, or it's titled Stir Shaken After June 30th. When I thought about this in aggregate, a quote came to mind immediately from Winston Churchill. Now this quote was with respect to World War II and the Battle of Britain, but he said something there that he might just as well have said about Stir Shaken after June 30th. And it goes kind of like this: June 30th. So this is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, as we've seen. There's lots of stuff coming up, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Very clever turn of phrase, as you might expect from Winston Churchill, but I think that perfectly sums up what we've talked about today. We are, as we approach June 30th, getting to the end of the very beginning of Stir Shaken, but as we've seen, that there is a lot to come, and this is going to be a dynamic space with a lot of activity and hopefully a lot of success. With that, Jim, I think we have a last poll question, right?
Correct. First of all, Michael, excellent presentation. I think in the 55 minutes you've given us a really excellent overview of the technology, the issues, and the opportunities. So we've got about 5 minutes left for Q&A. We've gone a little bit long, but we want to get this poll question in here too. So the question is, what future Stir Shaken service scenarios do you think will be the most challenging to implement? Is it enterprise Stir Shaken, international, global Stir Shaken, multi-leg diverted calls, emergency calls, or spam text messages? So if you can provide us now input, that would be helpful as well. And just also while we're waiting, the operator said at the beginning of today's session, for the audience member, there's in your interface, there's a opportunity for you to take a survey of today's session. If you can take that survey before we wrap up, that would be helpful to help us plan for future sessions. So while we're waiting for the audience here, just as we just got a lot of questions came in the last 2 minutes. And I'm going to go back to one that goes back to your diagram where you had the 3 scenarios, and you talked about the first scenario was a U.S. roamer. So case 1, the question was for case 1, how does the USA service provider determine the originating operator to be checked against the RMD? I guess if they're roaming, how does the terminating service provider validate that U.S. roamer is on a roaming operator X?
So that is a great and loaded question, actually. I might almost say we don't know yet because this is just going into service. But the legal interpretation would be who was the last hop carrier, which may not at all be the carrier from which the call originated. But the only thing that the receiving carrier in the United States can definitively know is who did they receive it from. So we believe that's in general going to be the standard. If that carrier is in the robocall mitigation database, the call will be allowed to proceed.
Okay. And that would be different whether or not
that's a whole. Sorry.
Would if they were using an IPX provider to terminate that, would that have any difference? Would that make any impact at all?
Well, that's what how many levels of indirection do we want to talk about, Jim? So yes, it would, and it has the effect of shielding the originating carrier, and that's why I say this is interesting. This may be a bit of a hole.
Okay, got it. Okay, the audience basically came back and said that international global Stir Shaken would be the most challenging to implement, 37%, followed by multi-leg diverted calls, and then enterprise Stir Shaken, and then spam. So any surprises here from your perspective, Michael?
Yeah, I'm surprised that international would attract so much attention. Actually, I expected the answer to be enterprise, to be the larger one, simply because it's the more immediate and pressing opportunity here in the United States.
Right.
Jim, what's your question?
Yeah, well, this question is also about most challenging to implement, not necessarily the one that would be implemented. But I can, and maybe it goes back to what we just talked about. If you've got an IPX connection, GRX, you've got MVNO, so multi-SIM, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of different moving parts from the device. So I think that's probably, and the scenario with the family trying to use the landline. There's a lot of different coin boxes still out there. So, okay, so with that, we're going to try to get one more question in before we wrap up here. And that question is, I'm just going to go through it quickly, it's an interesting question. It's related to how does this work on a SIP trunk connected PBX, and what do PBX vendors need to do? Is there something they would need to do? Obviously, if it's just SIP, then if it's SIP shaken, it should be pretty straightforward. But is there something specific that would have to be done?
Gosh, that's a really deep question, Jim. That goes to what is the architecture for enterprise stir shake.
Yeah.
And I think the fastest answer, however, is that in the best implementation, the enterprise and the enterprise PBX don't have to do anything. All of this can be covered at the receiving carrier, particularly in the case of a SIP trunk, where in general you're going to find that the numbering resources being used by the PBX are numbers that have been either presented by the carrier who is terminated, who the call is being terminated to, or by another redundant carrier that you can typically delegate certificates or do other mechanisms for to ensure that the originating carrier can validate that that number is actually valid. So in general, the enterprise shouldn't have to do anything. The responsibility can be placed on the terminating service provider, and that terminating service provider can do all the work and charge the enterprise for that service.
Great. Okay, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. There's some more questions. We're not going to get a chance to, but we may get back to after the event. So first of all, I'd like to thank Michael Campbell from NetNumber for providing us an excellent presentation and update on what's happening today in Stir Shake and what's going to happen in the future. And I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for attending today's session and providing us input and questions, input to our poll question and questions for the Q&A. So for light reading, this is Jim Hodges. Thanks, everyone, for attending. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.